What happens after happily ever after? The question, delivered in the piping, serious tone only a 7-year-old can properly achieve, hung in the oppressive silence of the Blackwood morning room. Lady Annalise Finch, who had been describing the precise shade of blue she intended for her next ball gown, blinked her large cow-like eyes. The porcelain teacup in her hand gave a delicate, uncertain rattle against its saucer. She looked from the boy, Arthur, to the girl, Alice. They stood before her, identical in their formal mourning clothes and the unnerving stillness of their shared gaze. They were perfect little dolls carved from ivory and jet, their dark hair mirroring their father's, their eyes a startling, inquisitive blue. "Why, whatever do you mean, darling?" Lady Annalise's voice was a high, sugary thing that grated on the nerves. "After the story ends, the book closes. That is all." "No," Alice said, her voice a whisper of steel. "It does not just end. The prince and princess get married. They live happily ever after. What happens then?" Lady Annalise glanced towards the far end of the room, where the Duke of Blackwood stood staring out the window, his back a rigid wall of black broadcloth. He had not moved or spoken in 20 minutes. He was a monument to grief and duty, and the entire reason she was suffering this bizarre interrogation by his progeny. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded like tearing silk, "the princess, I suppose, would order a great many new gowns and plan a magnificent banquet. One must have society to consider." Arthur's small mouth tightened into a line of disapproval. "That is not it." "It is a silly question," Lady Annalise snapped, her manufactured sweetness finally cracking. "Children should concern themselves with lessons, not the endings of fairy tales." From his post by the window, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, did not turn. But he heard. He heard everything. He had heard this same strange question posed to 4 other prospective duchesses over the past 6 months. He had heard their flustered, dismissive answers. He had watched his children's faces fall, their small shoulders slump in shared, silent disappointment. He felt a familiar, weary ache settle behind his ribs. It was the house, he thought. The house itself was drowning in silence and memory. Since Amelia's death 2 years ago, Blackwood Manor had become a mausoleum. Its vast corridors echoed with the absence of laughter. Its grand rooms were shrouded in dust sheets and sorrow. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and wilted lilies, a permanent funereal perfume. He was the warden of this beautiful prison, and his children were his fellow inmates. His solicitor and his mother, the Dowager Duchess, were in agreement. What the house needed, what the children needed, what the Duke needed, was a new duchess. A sensible, well-bred woman to restore order and bring light back into the shadowed corners of their lives. So the parade had begun. A procession of eligible, beautiful, titled women, all vying for the honor of becoming the next Duchess of Blackwood. They saw the title, the fortune, the handsome, tragic Duke. They saw a prize bull to be won at market. They did not see the 2 small wounded souls who stood at the heart of it all. They did not see the boy who broke his toys in fits of silent rage, or the girl who hid in cupboards and did not speak for hours. And they certainly did not understand the question. Alistair finally turned from the window. He met his children's eyes across the vast expanse of Aubusson carpet. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was their secret signal. Test failed. Instantly, Arthur and Alice turned and walked from the room, their backs ramrod straight, their footsteps perfectly in unison. They did not say goodbye. Lady Annalise stood, her face flushed with indignation. "Your Grace, your children are quite extraordinarily rude." "They are grieving, Lady Annalise," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of warmth. "As am I. Perhaps you are right. It is a silly question." He moved to the bell-pull. "I will have your carriage brought around." Her humiliation was a small, petty thing, but it was the only satisfaction he had felt all day. When she was gone, he walked through the silent hall to his study. The room was his sanctuary, lined with books he no longer read and maps of lands he no longer wished to see. He poured a measure of brandy, the amber liquid catching the gray afternoon light. He was failing them. He knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the marble of Amelia's tomb. He was a duke. He managed vast estates, advised politicians, and commanded the deference of hundreds. But he could not manage the hearts of 2 7-year-old children. He could not answer their simple, impossible question himself. What happened after happily ever after was supposed to be this: the quiet contentment of family, the rhythm of the seasons on the land. Instead, it had become this hollow, aching void. The door to the study opened without a knock. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, stood there, her hands clasped over her starched white apron. She had been with his family since before he was born and was the only person in the world who was not afraid of him. "Your Grace," she said, her tone brooking no argument, "the new governess has arrived." Alistair sighed. The fifth one in 6 months. The twins had a terrifying talent for rooting their minders. The last one had fled in tears after claiming Alice had tried to bewitch her with a dead spider. "Send her in, Mrs. Gable," he said, draining his glass. "And then send for my solicitor. I need to update the list of agencies we have exhausted." "This one is different, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, a strange note in her voice. "She did not come from an agency." A woman stepped into the room from behind the housekeeper. She was not what he expected. She was not a grim, sour-faced spinster or a flighty, terrified girl. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple but well-made traveling dress of dove-gray wool. Her hair, a warm shade of brown, was coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. There were no fripperies, no ribbons, no desperate attempts at fashion. She looked calm. That was the first thing he noticed, a deep, unshakable calm. "Miss Vance," Mrs. Gable announced, then retreated, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. Eleanor Vance stood before the Duke of Blackwood, her hands folded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was not calm. She was terrified. This was her last chance. After the unpleasantness in her last post, her reputation was fragile. A position in a ducal household was a miracle, one she owed entirely to a distant connection of her late mother's who had recommended her to the housekeeper at Blackwood. She had heard the stories: a tragic, reclusive duke, 2 impossible feral children, a house haunted by grief. It sounded like a Gothic novel, and she was walking into the first chapter. She looked at the man before her. He was even more imposing than the rumors suggested. Tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with a surprising amount of silver at the temples for a man said to be only in his early 30s. His face was a mask of aristocratic hauteur, but his eyes, a shade of blue so dark they were almost black, were weary. They were the eyes of a man who had not slept properly in years. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was like stone grinding on stone. "I will be direct. My children are difficult. They have driven away 4 of your predecessors. They will do their utmost to drive you away as well. Why should I believe you will be any different?" Eleanor took a breath, the scent of old paper and brandy filling her lungs. She thought of the dwindling coins in her purse. She thought of the shame of her family's ruin, the reason she was here at all, a lady born, forced to serve. She had survived far worse than 2 difficult children. "Because, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am not afraid of difficult things, and I believe children are rarely difficult without a reason." Alistair looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. There was an intelligence in her gaze, a quiet strength in the set of her jaw. She had not flinched, she had not simpered, she had answered him directly. It was refreshing. "They have refused to speak to anyone but each other for the past week," he warned. "Their last governess believed my daughter was a practitioner of the dark arts." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips, a fleeting, wry expression. "I have no formal training in exorcism, Your Grace, but I am quite proficient with soap and water, which I find is an effective counter to most curses invoked by 7-year-olds. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a genuine, if startled, laugh escaped Alistair's lips. It was a rusty, unused sound. It surprised them both. He leaned back in his chair, a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a distant cousin to it, stirring in his chest. "Very well, Miss Vance. The position is yours, for as long as you can bear it. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. You will meet the terrors in the morning." Eleanor curtsied, a graceful movement that spoke of a breeding he had not expected. "Thank you, Your Grace." As she walked from the room, Alistair found himself staring at the closed door. Different, Mrs. Gable had said. He had to admit she was certainly that. But Blackwood had a way of breaking different things. He picked up his glass, intending to pour another brandy. He stopped, the decanter in his hand. For the first time all day, he felt he might not need it. Eleanor's rooms were in a quiet wing of the house, adjacent to the nursery. They were comfortable, if dated, with a small fireplace and a window overlooking a walled garden that had gone to ruin. Weeds choked the rose bushes, and moss grew thick on the stone paths. It was a perfect metaphor for the entire estate. Beautiful once, now neglected and sad. She spent the evening unpacking her few belongings: a handful of worn books, a change of clothes, and a small silver locket she kept pinned inside her dress. It contained the last vestiges of her former life, miniature portraits of her mother and father. They had lost everything: their fortune, their good name, all of it consumed in a fire of speculation and scandal not of their making. She had been left with nothing but her education and her pride. The latter, she was discovering, was a luxury she could no longer afford. The next morning, she entered the nursery. The room was a disaster zone, a battlefield of discarded toys, torn books, and overturned furniture. And in the center of the chaos, sitting back to back on the floor, were the twins. They ignored her entrance completely, continuing a whispered conversation in a language that seemed to be entirely their own. Eleanor did not try to impose order. She did not greet them or demand they stand. Instead, she walked to the window seat, sat down, and took a small, battered book from her pocket. It was a collection of Grimm's fairy tales, the spine held together with tape. She opened it and began to read aloud, her voice soft and even. She chose the story of the Goose Girl, the princess who is betrayed and forced to live as a commoner, her identity stolen. She read about the talking horse, Falada, whose head is mounted on the wall and continues to speak the truth. For an hour there was no sound in the room but her voice and the rustle of pages. The twins did not move, but Eleanor, watching them from the corner of her eye, saw their whispered conversation stop. She saw Arthur's hand, which had been methodically tearing the pages from a picture book, grow still. She saw Alice's head tilt just slightly in her direction. She finished the story, closed the book, and placed it beside her on the window seat. She did not look at them. She simply sat, waiting. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, challenging thing. Then a small voice. Her horse was her only friend, Alice said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Yes, Eleanor replied, still looking out the window at the ruined garden. Sometimes a friend is the only thing you have left. They cut off his head, Arthur said, his voice thick with outrage. Yes, Eleanor said again. People can be very cruel when they are afraid of the truth. Another silence. Eleanor's heart was pounding. This was the crucial moment. Arthur stood up. He walked over to a large toy chest and pulled out a wooden soldier. Its arm was broken, dangling by a sliver of wood. He had the look of a general surveying a fallen comrade. He walked to her, holding it out. His expression was a challenge. He's broken, he said. Yes, he is, Eleanor agreed. She took the soldier from him, her fingers brushing his. His hand was surprisingly warm. She examined the break. But I do not think he is broken forever. I think, with a little glue and a very steady hand, he might be able to hold his sword again. She looked up and met Arthur's gaze. His eyes, so like his father's, were wide and searching. For the first time, she was not looking at a difficult child. She was looking at a small boy who was lost and hurting. Alice had come to stand beside her brother. She pointed to the book. Are there more stories? A great many, Eleanor said softly, enough to last a very long time. That afternoon, she did not attempt lessons. Instead, she found a pot of glue in a dusty scullery, and with the twins watching in solemn silence, she carefully mended the soldier's arm. They then found a length of red thread in her sewing kit and fashioned a new sash for him. When he was whole again, Arthur placed him not in the toy chest, but on the mantelpiece, a place of honor. Over the next few weeks, a quiet routine settled in. Lessons were a negotiation. Eleanor discovered the twins were fiercely intelligent, but bored by rote memorization, so she taught them geography by drawing maps of fantastical lands from her stories. She taught them arithmetic by calculating the supplies needed for a sea voyage to find a lost continent. She taught them botany in the ruined garden, identifying the weeds and discussing what might be planted in their place. They began to talk to her, not in torrents, but in trickles. They told her about their mother, how she smelled of lavender and had a laugh like wind chimes. They showed her their secret hiding places, a dusty attic room filled with forgotten treasures, a hollow oak tree at the edge of the woods. They brought her their broken things, not just toys, but a bird with a broken wing, a torn drawing, a bruised feeling. And she, in her quiet, steady way, showed them how to mend them. She was becoming fond of them, terribly, dangerously fond. She knew it was a mistake. A governess was a servant. She was temporary. To love these children was to set herself up for a new, more painful kind of heartbreak. But she couldn't seem to stop herself. Alistair watched the transformation from a distance. The nursery, once a source of dread and shouting, was now often quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. A peaceful, productive silence, sometimes broken by the sound of Eleanor's low, melodic voice reading, or, on rare occasions, a shared giggle from one of the twins. He found excuses to walk past. He told himself it was his duty as their father to ensure their new governess was not being terrorized. But he knew it was more than that. He was drawn to the small pocket of warmth she had created in his cold, cavernous house. One afternoon, he was in his study when he heard a sound he had not heard in 2 years. Laughter. Not a giggle, but a full, unrestrained peal of it. It was Alice. He stood and walked to the door, opening it a crack. The hallway was empty, the sound coming from the garden. He followed it to the French doors that led from the drawing room onto the terrace. The scene before him stopped him in his tracks. Eleanor and the twins were in the walled garden. But it was not the ruined, choked space he remembered. In the center, a large patch had been cleared. The earth was turned dark and rich. Eleanor, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of dirt on her cheek, was showing Arthur how to plant a row of seeds. Alice was watering a small, struggling rosebush they had evidently rescued from the weeds. She was laughing because the watering can had tipped, splashing water all over her boots and the hem of her dress. She looked up and saw him watching. The laughter died in her throat. She looked like a startled fawn ready to bolt. Eleanor straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Your Grace?" Alistair stepped out onto the terrace. The air felt different out here. It smelled of damp earth and possibility. "I was not aware gardening was part of the curriculum, Miss Vance," he said. His voice was stiffer than he intended. The sight of them, so happy, so complete without him, had sent a strange, sharp pang through his chest. It felt like jealousy. "The children were interested in where plants come from," Eleanor said, her calm returning. It seemed a more effective lesson than merely reading about it in a book. "We are planting a resurrection garden," Alice announced proudly. "Miss Vance says you can bring things back to life if you give them enough light and care." The words struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He looked from his daughter's hopeful face to Eleanor's quiet, watchful one. He looked at the patch of cleared earth in the middle of the overgrown garden, a resurrection garden. "I see," he said, his voice rough. He felt exposed, as if they were talking about him, about the whole house, about his entire life. He turned and walked back inside without another word, the sound of the closing doors shutting out the light. That evening, Lady Honoria Ashworth came to dinner. Her visits had become more frequent, her campaign for the title of Duchess more overt. She was beautiful, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a will of iron. My mother, Alistair thought with a grimace, would adore her. She swept into the dining room in a gown of emerald green silk that shimmered like snakeskin. "Alistair, darling," she purred, offering a cool cheek for him to kiss. "You look tired. You are working too hard." Dinner was an ordeal. Honoria kept up a constant stream of glittering, meaningless chatter about society gossip, who was marrying whom, who was on the verge of ruin. It was a language Alistair had once spoken fluently, but now it just sounded like noise. His mind kept drifting back to the garden, to the smudge of dirt on Eleanor Vance's cheek, to his daughter's pronouncement about bringing things back to life. And of course, the children, Honoria was saying, drawing his attention back. They simply cannot be allowed to run wild. "When we are married, Alistair, the first thing I shall do is hire a proper firm master for the boy and send the girl away to a good school in Switzerland. It is the only way to instill discipline." The fork in Alistair's hand stilled. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the beautiful facade. He saw a woman who valued order above all else, who saw his children not as people, but as problems to be managed. "My children will be staying at Blackwood," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "with their governess." Honoria's eyes narrowed. "The governess? The little grey mouse? Alistair, you cannot be serious. She allows them to play in the dirt. It is unseemly." "She has them reading," he countered, and laughing. "I find those to be far more seemly accomplishments." An uncomfortable silence fell. Honoria recovered first, plastering a smile back on her face. "Of course, darling, you are their father. You know best. For now." Later that evening, after Honoria had finally departed, in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely concealed frustration, Alistair found himself walking the halls. He was too restless to sleep, too agitated to sit in his study. He walked past the nursery wing. A thin sliver of light shone from beneath Eleanor's door. He should not. It was improper. He was the Duke. She was the governess. There were lines that could not be crossed. He knocked. The door opened a moment later. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in a simple wool dressing gown, her hair in a long braid over her shoulder. She looked younger without the severe bun, her face softer in the candlelight. "Your Grace?" Her eyes were wide with surprise and a little fear. "Is something wrong? Are the children all right?" "The children are fine," he said quickly. I apologize for the intrusion. I saw your light." "I was just reading," she said, gesturing to the book in her hand. He saw the title. It was a book of poetry, something he had not touched in years. "May I ask?" he began, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "What you were reading to them today, in the garden?" "The Secret Garden," she replied. "It is a story about a hidden, neglected place and the children who bring it back to life." "Of course it was. And you think it can be done? A place like that can be resurrected?" She looked at him, and in the quiet intimacy of the late hour, with the rest of the house asleep, the carefully constructed walls between them seemed to thin. She was not just a governess. He was not just a duke. They were two people standing in a hallway, talking about gardens and grief. "I believe anything can be brought back to life, Your Grace," she said softly. "If one is willing to do the work, to pull the weeds and let in the sun. It is slow, and it is difficult, but it is not impossible." He stood there for a long moment, simply looking at her. He felt a profound, aching need to step into the small circle of her candlelight, to let some of her quiet, steady hope wash over him. "Thank you, Miss Vance," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You have given me a great deal to think about." He retreated to his own cold, dark wing of the house, but for the first time he felt as if a window had been opened somewhere, letting in a breath of fresh, clean air. The next day something shifted in the house. Alistair came down to breakfast not in his usual remote study, but in the small family dining room. The twins, brought down by Eleanor, stared at him as if he were an exotic creature newly installed in a zoo. He did not say much. He read his newspaper. But he was there. When Arthur spilled his milk, instead of the usual stiff silence, Alistair simply signaled for a cloth and said, "It happens." He started taking them with him on his rides around the estate. He showed Arthur how to check the fences and talked to him about the tenant farms. He pointed out different breeds of birds to Alice, telling her the names his own father had taught him. Eleanor always came with them, a quiet presence on a steady mare, her sketchbook in hand to draw the things they saw. During these excursions, he and Eleanor talked, not about grief or gardens, but about simple things: books, the weather, the history of the land. He learned she was from Northumberland, that her father had been a scholar with a passion for local folklore. He learned she had a dry, witty sense of humor that she usually kept carefully hidden. She, in turn, learned things about him: that his stern exterior hid a deep love for his land, that he knew the name of every tenant farmer, their wives, their children, that he had once dreamed of being an architect and had designed the new wing of the local hospital himself. They were building a fragile bridge of understanding across the chasm of their different stations. Lady Honoria viewed these developments with increasing alarm. She saw her carefully laid plans crumbling. She saw the Duke slipping away from her, drawn into the orbit of this quiet, dowdy governess. She decided it was time to act. Her method was simple and brutal. She hired a man, an investigator of the most unscrupulous kind, to dig into Eleanor Vance's past. Every woman had a secret, she reasoned. It was simply a matter of finding it and using it. It took him 2 weeks. The report he delivered was better than she could have hoped for. Eleanor Vance was not Eleanor Vance. Her real name was Eleanor Ainsworth. Her father, a respected academic, had not simply died. He had died in debtor's prison, his name and fortune destroyed by a reckless investment scheme that had ruined dozens of families. The scandal had been immense. Eleanor and her mother had been cast out of society, disgraced and penniless. Honoria held the report in her hands like a weapon. This was it, the silver bullet that would slay the little grey mouse and restore the proper order of things. She chose her moment perfectly. The Duke was hosting a small, formal dinner for some local dignitaries. It was the first time he had entertained on such a scale since his wife's death. It was a sign that he was re-engaging with the world, and Honoria intended to be the one on his arm as he did so. After dinner, as the gentlemen were enjoying their port, Honoria found Alistair alone in the library. She feigned distress, her hand fluttering to her chest. "Alistair, I have discovered something so dreadful I hardly know how to tell you." He turned, his expression wary. "What is it, Honoria?" "It is about the governess," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I have it on the very best authority. that she is an imposter. She laid it all out for him, the scandal, the disgrace, the assumed name. She presented it as a matter of grave concern, a danger to his children. Who knows what a woman of that background is capable of? She has lied her way into your home, into your confidence. She must be dismissed immediately, for the children's safety. Alistair listened, his face an unreadable mask. He took the report she offered him, his eyes scanning the neatly typed pages. He saw the name Ainsworth, the details of the financial ruin, the cold, clinical account of a family's destruction. When he looked up, his eyes were like chips of ice. "Where did you get this?" "I have my sources," Honoria said, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "I was concerned for you, for the children." "You were concerned for yourself," he said, his voice flat. "You had her investigated. You paid a man to dig through the ashes of her life to find a weapon you could use against her." Honoria recoiled. "I did it to protect you. She is a liar, the daughter of a bankrupt and a scoundrel." "Her father was a man who made a mistake," Alistair said, his voice rising, a cold fury building in him. "A mistake for which he and his family paid a terrible price, and she has done nothing but bring warmth and light and healing to this house that you would see turned back into a tomb. She has spent months mending my broken children, and you fault her for trying to mend her own broken life?" He strode to the fireplace and threw the report into the flames. The pages curled, blackened, and were consumed. "I have made my own inquiries about Miss Vance, Honoria," he said, turning back to her. "I know who she is. I have known for weeks. It was a lie, but a necessary one." He had not known the details, but he had suspected her origins were more complicated than she let on. It did not matter. "What I have learned is that she is a woman of unparalleled strength, integrity, and compassion. Everything, in fact, that you are not." Honoria stared at him, her face pale with shock and rage. "You would choose a disgraced servant over me?" "I would choose a good woman over a cruel one, yes," he said. "Now I believe your carriage is waiting. Do not return to Blackwood again." He left her there, sputtering in the firelight, and went in search of Eleanor. He found her in the nursery, checking on the sleeping twins. The room was tidy, peaceful. The mended soldier stood sentinel on the mantelpiece. She turned as he entered, a question in her eyes. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice softer now. "Eleanor, there is something I must tell you." He told her everything. About Honoria's investigation, about the report, about his response. He watched her face as he spoke, saw the flicker of fear give way to a profound, weary sadness, and then to a quiet, guarded relief. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. "So you know," she said finally. "I know that your name is Eleanor Ainsworth," he said, stepping closer. "And I know that you have suffered a great injustice. I cannot undo the past, but I will not allow it to be used as a weapon against you. Not now, not ever. You have a home here at Blackwood for as long as you wish it." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the candlelight. They were the first tears he had ever seen her shed. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because," he said, the truth of it hitting him with the force of a revelation. "You are teaching us all how to live again. You are pulling the weeds. You are letting in the sun." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek. His touch was a spark, an electric jolt that sent a tremor through her. The chasm between them, of station, of past, of grief, suddenly seemed very small. It felt like a space that could be crossed. In the days that followed Honoria's banishment, a new peace settled over the manor, but it was a peace fraught with a new, unspoken tension. The lines between Duke and Governess, employer and employee, were blurring into something unrecognizable. They were Alistair and Eleanor, two people circling a fragile, unacknowledged hope. The children, oblivious to the adult dramas swirling around them, had their own agenda. They had watched their father defend Miss Vance, had seen the venomous glare of Lady Honoria, and had drawn their own conclusions. Miss Vance was theirs. She was part of their pack, and there was one final test she had to pass. They chose the location with care. It was their most sacred place, the dusty, sun-drenched attic filled with the ghosts of Beaumont ancestors. It smelled of old wood, dried lavender, and time itself. They led her there one sunny afternoon, under the pretext of showing her a trunk of old-fashioned clothes. Arthur and Alice stood before her, their faces scrubbed clean, their expressions as solemn as judges. They had been practicing. "Miss Vance," Arthur began, his voice formal. "Eleanor," she corrected gently. You may call me Eleanor when we are not in lessons. The twins exchanged a look. This was even better. Eleanor, Alice said, picking up the thread, we have a question for you, a very important question. Eleanor knelt down so she was at their eye level. The sunlight from the dormer window caught the dust motes, making them dance like tiny fairies around their heads. I am listening. Arthur took a deep breath. What happens after happily ever after? There it was. The question. The one Alistair had told her about, the one that had stumped a half-dozen of the finest ladies in England. She looked at their serious, waiting faces and understood this was no idle query. It was a plea. It was a map they needed to navigate the strange new country of their lives. She did not give them a fairy tale. She gave them the truth, or at least her version of it. Well, she began, choosing her words carefully, I think happily ever after is not an ending. It is not a place you arrive at, like a train station. I think it is a garden. The twins' eyes widened. They understood gardens. When the story ends, the prince and princess have just been given a plot of land, she continued. At first, it might be beautiful, full of flowers, but gardens do not stay beautiful on their own. Storms come and break the branches. Weeds grow and try to choke the good plants. Sometimes a long winter comes and you think nothing will ever grow again. She glanced at their faces, saw the flicker of understanding. They knew about storms and long winters. So happily ever after is the work you do after the story is over. It is pulling the weeds together, it is mending the broken branches, it is planting new seeds in the spring, even if you are not sure they will grow. It is sometimes being sad and sometimes being angry, but always, always taking care of the garden. Together. It is not one big happiness. It is 1,000 small moments of choosing to make things beautiful again, every single day. She finished, her voice soft in the quiet attic. The twins were silent. They looked at each other, a long communicative glance that needed no words. Then, in perfect unison, they launched themselves at her, their small arms wrapping around her neck. Arthur's face was buried in her shoulder, his voice muffled. You gave the right answer. Alice's breath was warm against her ear. The only right answer. Eleanor hugged them back, her own eyes stinging. She held them tight, these two lost, lonely children, and felt a fierce, protective love that took her breath away. She did not know that Alistair had followed them. He had seen them lead her up the winding stairs to the attic, and, drawn by a force he no longer bothered to question, he had come after them. He stood in the shadows of the doorway, and he had heard it all. He had heard her give his children the one thing he had been unable to, a believable hope, a roadmap for the future that was not built on fantasy, but on resilience, work, and shared commitment. A garden. He watched her kneeling in the beam of sunlight, his children clinging to her, and the final wall around his heart crumbled to dust. It was not just admiration he felt for this woman, it was not gratitude, it was love. A deep, quiet, certain love that felt like coming home after a long and bitter winter. He stepped out of the shadows. The three of them looked up, startled. Eleanor's face flushed as she started to rise, to put the space of propriety back between them. Stay, he said, his voice thick. He walked towards them and knelt down himself, joining them in the pool of sunlight. He was no longer the Duke of Blackwood standing on high. He was a man, a father on the floor of an attic. He reached out and took Eleanor's hand. It was calloused from gardening, stained with ink from lessons. It was the most beautiful hand he had ever seen. Eleanor, he said, his voice shaking slightly, I have a question for you. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. Will you help me tend this garden? Will you help me pull the weeds and plant new seeds? Will you marry me and make happily ever after with us every single day? Tears were now streaming freely down her face, but she was smiling. The twins looked between the two adults, their faces alight with a dawning, triumphant joy. Yes, Eleanor whispered. Yes. 1,000 times. Yes. Alistair brought her hand to his lips, and then, in the dusty, sunlit attic, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the bright promise of the future, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. It was the sealing of a pact, the first step in a new story. Their wedding was a quiet affair, held in the small chapel on the Blackwood estate. The only guests were the tenants, Mrs. Gable, and a few trusted friends. Alice was the flower girl, scattering petals from their resurrected garden. Arthur was the ring-bearer, carrying the ring on a satin pillow with the gravity of a field marshal. The mended soldier was tucked into his pocket for good luck. When the vicar asked who gave this woman, there was a moment of awkward silence. Eleanor had no father to do the honors. Then Arthur and Alice stepped forward, took her hands, and placed them in their father's. It was the most fitting answer of all. Life at Blackwood Manor was transformed. The dust sheets were removed, the windows thrown open. The sound of the twins' laughter became a common currency echoing through the long corridors. Eleanor, the new Duchess, did not fill Amelia's shoes. She brought her own. She filled the house not just with light, but with purpose. She started a school for the tenants' children in one of the empty wings. She worked alongside Alistair, her keen mind and compassionate heart a perfect complement to his sense of duty. She never lost her love for the quiet corners of life. She still took her sketchbook to the woods. She still read stories aloud in the evenings. But now, when she did, her husband was beside her, his arm around her, his voice sometimes joining hers in the telling. One evening, a year or so after their wedding, the four of them were sitting by the fire in the library. The twins were in their nightclothes, sleepy and content. Alistair was reading aloud from a book of adventures. Alice, her head resting on Eleanor's lap, looked up. "Mama," she said, the word still new and wonderful on her tongue. "What happens after this happily ever after?" Eleanor smiled and looked at her husband over the children's heads. Alistair paused in his reading, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the love, the peace, the life they had built together from the ruins. He knew the answer now. He had learned it by heart. He closed the book, marking the page. "That," he said, his voice full of a quiet, certain joy, "is a story we will all write together. Tomorrow."